Hey everyone, Andrew here, and welcome back to part 2 of the series. So, this is kind of where we left off last time. Just for anyone who might be, new to this, we're trying to make a Slack clone, and the idea is over the course of time, we'll make a full stack app with Django and Vue. So last week we made this simple interface with Vue and Tailwind CSS. This week I want to try to add a little bit more interactivity, so we have a good foundation, but I'm going to add features like editing, deleting messages, sending new messages. Right now this doesn't work. As well as maybe some basic like switching between these different channels to update the name of the channel here. And so, yeah, let's get right into it. Okay, so, yep, this is where we were last time. And first things first, last time we had everything hard-coded, all the values hard-coded into each component. So right now, the first thing I'm going to do is go through all the components and use computed properties and props to essentially dynamically set the data. But for now, we'll still be eventually passing in this data in like a hard-coded fashion. Eventually, we're going to get that from the REST API, but for now, it's still going to have to be just somewhat manual. Okay, so let's start with the message, single message view. As you can see here, like the name, the profile source, even, the text and timestamp, these are all got to be changed. So let's just make a computer property for each of these values. And the way we're going to get that is we're going to take in a prop for the user, or sorry, not the user, the message. And for now, we're going to do any. I'm going to add TypeScript more so later for now. So my TypeScript is going to basically be non-existent right now. I'm just going to be putting anywhere, and just, that's not the best practice. So anyways, let's import prop, and we're going to take in the message as a prop. And then we're going to do a bunch of computed properties. And, always use string templates when you can. And we're going to make some assumptions here about, the way that this data is going to be formatted. Obviously, this could change after we develop our backend REST API. Like these fields can change and the way we get this data can change. But for now, I'm just going to make like a kind of reasonable assumption about how we might get this data. If you're unfamiliar with backend REST API development, this might seem kind of random to you. And so I'm sorry about that. Just bear with me, and I'm sure it'll make more sense once we get into Django. So we need the name, profile source. Actually, this one doesn't need a template. And so I'm assuming there's going to be a field called sender on the message, which will basically contain some metadata about the sender. Otherwise, we'll just get the fields directly off the message prop. So these are kind of all the fields that we would need. And let's just go ahead and start replacing these, right? So I'm going to use this view double bracket syntax. And we're just going to go ahead and replace all our hard-coded values with these computed properties. Oh, whoops, what am I doing? Okay, okay, so that should be good for now. Okay, and then let's just go through some of the other, continue to some to the other components and do the exact same thing. So for this one, this is the messages container. And as you can see, we're just kind of iterating randomly like 50 of these messages, but that's not what we really want to be doing. So we're going to take a prop, import that, and we're going to call this all messages, and it's just going to be a list. Eventually we might want to type this into like we might have a model type on the front end. I'll show you guys how to do that in a different episode, but let's go here, and we want to iterate over the actual messages. And then the key, instead of that, we probably want to use, there should be some ID field on the message itself, and this will be helpful so that when we're removing or adding messages, Vue will be able to know which one we're referencing. And this is good. So now let's do conversation header. And this one, again, we're going to want to take a prop in. And for this one, I'm going to say conversation, call any. And we're going to have a few different fields, right? So the conversation name. Conversation description. Okay, this is why I use autocomplete. And okay, so this one is another bit of an assumption for how we're going to model the data. I'm currently thinking that we're going to be, I'm going to treat all conversations as the same, whether they are, channels or direct messages. And the reason I'm doing that is because they share a lot of similarities. Like even if it's a one-to-one direct message, right? It still has a name. It still has, it still keeps track of, which members are part of this conversation. It still has messages inside of it. And so it has basically a lot of the same properties as a channel. And so with that, I'm going to treat them all like as one larger superclass of like conversations. And eventually we'll kind of distinguish that. Well, yeah, we're going to distinguish it more so on the back end. So anyways, I'm going to assume that we're going to have some flag that basically says if this is a channel or not. And if it is a channel, well, obviously it's a channel. And otherwise, it's probably a direct message, like a one-to-one direct message or a group direct message. Okay. And so for this, I'm going to replace it with the conversation name, this with the conversation description. And so you might be wondering what I'm going to do with this. So in Slack, right, the channels, they show up with the pound sign in front of the name. So I'm going to do that here as well. I'm going to break this part out into a span underneath this. And then I'm going to have another span that is conditionally rendered using the conversation as channel. And then I'm going to add this. And then I'm going to add a non-breaking. This is a non-breaking space, meaning doesn't break it into new line. It's a little bit hacky, but the reason why I use this is because with Vue, right, the spaces actually do matter, right? So if I added a space here, that would add a space between these two things. But the thing is, I would rather make it a little more explicit, just so that it's not like, some random trailing white space or something. So yeah, that's why I did that. And then, okay, let's keep going and move. Let's keep going and let's change this into using props as well. So this one's a little heftier. So we're going to have to think about this real quick. So like I said, we want to treat conversations, both direct messages and channels, like kind of similarly. And then we had that flag, right, that we're assuming there's going to be an is channel flag to distinguish between channels and non-channels. So let's just start off as we always do and take in that prop. And we're going to call this conversations. And we're going to have two computed all channels. And I'm going to filter for all the channels based on the flag, right? And so this is just a pretty simple JavaScript, pretty common function for arrays, arrays. And you can do .filter, and whatever Boolean is returned here kind of determines whether or not this specific instance will show up in the newly filtered list. So it's for every channel in for every conversation in conversations array, if c.isChannel is true, then include it, otherwise don't. And we're going to do the exact opposite in this one. Okay, cool. So now we have those two. Then we need to kind of find out, okay, so we're iterating here and here, right? This is where we iterate over all of them. So this part is the channel section. And I'm going to do that. Keep the pound sign there, that's hard-coded. And then say, so we're using this, the context here, the channel.name. It's another field that we're assuming is going to be there. And yeah, let's do the same thing here. So for every DM in all direct messages, and we want to make it the DM name. Yeah. Okay. I think that should be pretty comprehensive for this section. And let me just fix this import indent. Okay, awesome. Now let's go into the root the kind of root view here, chat.view, and we want to add all of that hard-coded data that I was talking about. So you see, now we're using props for all of these components, right? But where are those props going to come from? It has to come from somewhere, right? In a production app, it would be coming from the REST API, like I said. But for now, we're going to define some data here at the root. And this is, you know, I can't stress stuff. This is not what it should look like in the end. This is just kind of how we're doing it for now. Okay, so here I'm going to define we need to keep track of which conversation is the currently selected conversation. And then we are going to create a list of like all the conversations that kind of exist that we want to render. And then we're also going to probably create a list of the messages of the current conversation. So technically it would make more sense to put that here. Just kind of group these variables logically. And so I'm going to create a list of preset messages, meaning like for I'm just going to say every single conversation, every time we switch to a new conversation, I'm going to populate it with some preset messages just so we can kind of see something there. It's not going to be blank, but it's going to be the same preset messages for every conversation that we switch into, right? So obviously that's not like how it's supposed to work in the real app, but just to give us a visual sense first. Okay. And so I'm going to populate all conversations and with some data. And this is just going to be some of the JSON objects that, and with some of the fields that we assume that they have. So for example, all of them should have an ID field. They should have a name, and it's going to be a description. And again, this is channel Boolean. And so we're going to, and so I'm just going to type a bunch of these out, and yeah, let's fast forward that real quick. Okay, so we have a bunch of these listed out, so 3 channels, as you can see, and then 4 direct messages. Some of them are group messages, some of them are individual messages. There's going to be a lot more logic that goes into this stuff later on the back end, but for now, just kind of simplify things. Okay, now let's make some of those preset messages. Again, each one is going to have an ID. And we assume that there's going to be the sender field, and the sender field should have the metadata on the person who sent the message, right? So these are the things that we wanted to see. And so again, I'm going to pull just a random pick some URL for this part. And that should be it for the sender part. Then we want to, add the timestamp. For now, I'm just going to do like this thing, which is basically, it kind of just gets the current time, right? And then converts it into like a string of the local time zone. and then here's the body of that message. And then let's just do it another one, but with a different person. And so here we have another message with a different sender, different profile source, different body message too. So, okay, let's keep it at that for now. And so so now I'm going to collapse these to kind of keep them out of the way. Okay, so now I'm going to create a created hook handler, basically because when this is first selected, as you can see, current messages and current conversation are null, but I actually want to populate these with some values by default, right? So I'm going to say that the current conversation is equal to just the first one in this array, and then since the messages are just going to be using the preset messages, I'm going to make it to a clone of the array of the preset messages. I don't want to set it directly to preset messages, because then if I modify current messages, I'm going to be modifying preset messages, which is not what I want to do. Okay, and so now that we've defined all this, the last thing we need to do here is to actually pass these props in. So with the chat sidebar, we need to pass in all the conversations, and we're just going to pass it the variable all conversations. For the conversation header, we need to pass it a single conversation, and so that's going to be the current conversation. Then for the messages container, it's going to be all the messages, and that is going to be equal to the current messages array. I don't think, nope, this doesn't have a prop, so that's that. Okay, so before we move on to adding some more logic to the interactivity, I'm going to do one thing first, and that is I want to create a global event bus. So what that means is an event bus is just a layer of communication, right, where you can kind of emit messages and then also add listeners to listen for certain messages. So for example, it could be like, oh, we received a new message, or like, oh, we selected a different conversation, and then some other listener is going to pick up on that and be like, oh, okay, selected a new conversation, now I need to do something. There's a way to communicate between components. So I'm going to add that here. You can actually use, since this is still Vue 2, you can use just a Vue instance as an event bus. And we're going to just add this to the Vue object, basically. And we're going to add it as this variable bus. And then we'll define a getter for this. And add the semicolon. And just a disclaimer, actually, technically the event bus is not supposed to be used in the way that I'm about to use it. I'm just using it to show you how it can be used in like a simpler project that's not, super large scale or like enterprise or something like that. In a large scale application, you just wouldn't really want to use the bus too heavily, because it's very it's very finicky, it can be really confusing, and like, oh, maybe you forgot to turn off a listener, and then it's doing weird things because the listener has persisted somehow across a component. And so yeah, basically a lot of times you can do using Vuex what you might want to do with this. You can just do it in Vuex instead, but that's going to be like a topic for probably a future video where we switch from using this kind of like janky setup into a more typical like large scale application setup with Vuex and stuff. And then we're just going to declare this on the TypeScript module in the shims view.declarations file. So right here we can just declare a module for the view type and define this interface view, and we're just going to put the bus on there, just so that we can access this variable inside our TypeScript supported Vue files. Okay, now that we've got that out of the way, let's start with some of the logic for a lot of the interactivity we wanted to add. So let's start with the sidebar. With the sidebar, every time you click one of these like channels or direct messages, we want to change the current conversation, right? That will change the name of the current conversation that you should see at the top, as well as in the future, like the messages inside, right? So let's see. We want to find the place where a user would click, and that's probably on this div. We can add these click handlers in here, but we need to find, what we're going to be, the function we're going to be using to handle them first. So we'll just define a function. Let's just call it select conversation, because again, they're going to be the same. It's going to take in a conversation, and then we're going to use the bus. So here you can see, we can have this property bus. Oops. And we want to emit a event. So the name of the event, we're going to say conversation selected. I think this is typically the naming convention they use for events, the colons. They like to do that. And we'll pass in the conversation ID. You could pass in the whole conversation or just the ID, but we really just need the ID. And then we're going to add that click handler. We're going to add that function to the click handlers. So whenever we click it, it's going to select the conversation based on the current conversation, and that's defined by channel for this part because we're iterating over all the channels. For here, it's going to be the direct message. Okay, and so now that we are emitting this event here, we need to also listen for it somewhere else, right? So right here in chat.vue, I'm going to put these side by side. So here, when we click something, it's going to emit this event, and now we want to receive the event somewhere and switch the conversation, right? So here, we're going to say, we're going to create some type of listener, and we use that using the on function. So on conversation selected, we're going to take in the argument, and here we see that we passed in conversation ID. So I'm going to say conversation ID, it's a string, and we need to do something with it, right? Sorry, that was kind of confusing. We need to call a function or perform some task using this, right? So here right now it's just empty, but let's create that function to switch the conversation. And we're going to say, let's just call it set conversation by ID. So it's going to take in a conversation ID, and then we want to set the current conversation based on that. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to say, we're going to define this current conversation is going to be equal to, and we use this function find, basically finds the first value that matches the Boolean value that we provide, and it's going to just stop there. So we're going to say, iterate all over all the conversations until we find one where the conversation ID is equal to the conversation ID that we passed in. So once that predicate is true, it will stop. And then we want to reset the current messages. And we're going to use the spread operator. Oh yeah, this spread operator, it just, I should have explained this earlier. It just takes all the elements in here and kind of unpacks it. So it's almost like saying, for every element in preset messages, put it into this array here. Yep. So now that we have that, once we are listening to this event, what we're going to want to do actually is just call set conversation by ID, passing in the conversation ID we got from the event itself, right? So the event has the name of the event and then the data that it passed, the payload. We call it the payload. So payload is the conversation ID. Okay, so that should work here. And then that should be it for that part. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, so now let's define the logic for sending a message. For that, we're going to go to the part where we type the message, which is the send message box, right? I'm going to close this out. And so what we want to do here is every time someone hits enter, basically, on this input field, right? We want to send the message to, the whatever current conversation is going on. We want to put it there, right? So we're going to add a few things here. First, we're going to add a variable called message text, and we're going to bind it to this input field. And this is, pretty standard Vue stuff, so I'm not going to explain that too much here. Okay, and so we want to create a handler for every time someone presses enter. And so whenever someone tries to send a message, we want to do this function. So first we're going to check, is there anything in the message at all? And as long as it's not empty, we're going to emit this event. I'm just going to call it message send. And we're going to pass in the message text as the payload. Then we want to reset our message text to nothing, right? Because after you send a message, it's going to delete the stuff. Okay, and now we need to add the handler here. So you would want to do @keyup.enter. That's the event that you want to listen for. This is a native HTML/JavaScript like event. Basically, the browser will automatically kind of emit these types of events. It's not like a custom Vue event that we're emitting or something. So every time we detect a key up on enter, so they press the enter key, then we're going to do send message. Okay, so that's all well and good, but again, we need to receive this emitted event somewhere. So we're going to do that here in chat.vue again. And we're going to do that by listening for that event. So first things first, we need to create the listener. And we're going to say this is the bus.on. We're going to say message send. And then the string of the text. So this is typo. Yeah, so that's going to do something, but we need to have the function, right? So let's say that this send message takes in the text as the string, right? And so we're going to say this.send message, pass in the text. Okay, so in this part, we want to basically add this message to the messages array of the current conversation, right? And so for now, that's just going to be current messages. Obviously in the future, we're going to be making some post request to the REST API to kind of actually create this message. But for now, we're going to do this kind of manually here on the front end. And so, yeah, we need to pass in an ID, and we want it to be unique. So I'm actually going to create a variable called message ID count. And this basically, so we already had 2 preset messages, right? And it's 0 and 1. We're going to do this and make it 2 so that basically, and increment it every time so that we're always like using a unique number essentially. And so we're going to use a string template for that and do like that. Okay, so for the sender data, I'm just going to create kind of a generic, user here modeled after me. Let me get another profile source. Okay, and then we want to add the timestamp as usual. I'm going to do that the same way we did the other ones. And a body text. Okay. So now every time we send a message, it should theoretically, we'll emit the text from over on the send message box, and then this will get picked up here. And then we're going to append it to this array. Okay, so we can take a quick look at what this looks like now. As you can see, we have these, and it's switching pretty well. As you can see, the data is now rendered dynamically as opposed to all just being the same. And we have these default messages. Oh, whoops, I might have messed this part up. We type a message, and okay, we have this here. I think my computed property might be off on single message. Oh, okay, yeah, so this should be message body text. And let's see, now this works. Let's type in this message. Okay, and so you see this is, yeah, kind of working for now. And then when we switch conversations, it resets it to this. Okay, cool. Okay, so now I want to work on the interface and the logic to edit a message. So first of all, let's work on the interface. To do that, I want to add, when we click this edit button, to have, it appear like the input box here, like in line with the message. And so we can edit it directly here and then have a cancel and a save button right here. And that's kind of similar to how Slack does it. And so let's do that first. Let's do the interface. And so let's do the interface part first. So first we want to go to, right here. Okay. And I'm going to add a few things here. So first we probably need some type of variable as a flag to say like, are we in the editing mode or not? And the new text that we would want to use for that, right? We're going to bind to the input. Then I'm going to add the elements here. So, okay, I'm going to add this. This part is, the normal part that we have. And we're going to say if it's not is editing. And then on top of it, we're going to add basically the same thing. And we're going to say vf equals is editing. So this div will show up if it is editing. And then I'm going to borrow from the send message box part. Kind of going to borrow this over here. Okay, so below this, we want to add a flex div with the two buttons that I described earlier. And so this is going to have a handler, and this is going to have a handler too. It's going to do the save edit part. This is like cancel. I'm going to call this reset edit. So now I need to define those functions, right? So we're going to have reset edit and not cancel, save edit. Okay, so with reset edit, I think what we want to do is set editing to false and then set the new text equal to the original text of the message. So set it to body, right? Because it's not supposed to be empty, but yep. And for save edit, similar to the other one, we want to check if there's any text in the first place. And then if there is, we're going to emit an event. And in this, we're going to include the ID of the message so that we know which message we're trying to edit, and then the text associated with it. And then after that, we reset the edit. And I'm going to create a created hook too. So the reason why I can't just set new text directly to message.body is because until the component is created, like when these variables are kind of defined, the prop might not have been instantiated yet. So we need to wait till this component is created. After a component is created, I'm going to say reset edit to set this part. Okay. And so that should be fine. The next part we need to do is actually how do we get into the editing mode, right? So for that, what's obviously going to come from the editing button. And we remember that in the single message actions, that's where the editing button is with the edit icon. And so we're going to add a click handler here. And what this should do is that when we click this part, it will we're going to emit a message, right? Kind of similar to the other ones. And we need to know which message is being edited. So actually we'll probably want to take a prop in here too for the message. And that way that when we actually click this, we can emit the message as a payload. Because again, right, it's like you need to know which one specifically you're trying to edit. So actually, let's just pass the ID. Then if we come back to the single message, we can kind of see, okay, now we need to add the listener for that emit, right? So what do we emit it as? Oh, I don't think it's, okay. I'm going to call it start edit instead of edit, because edit we're using here when we actually save the edit. So let's call it start edit. And we're going to say like, it's going to take in the message ID, right? And if the message ID is equal to this message ID, that means we're trying to edit this specific message. Then we'll set this is editing to true, right? And then this is the part I want to focus the input after we set is editing to true. And so I'm going to use this trick, next tick. And some of you all might already know this, but basically after we set this to true, right, it's going to take a second for the JavaScript to kind of like, it's going to register, is editing is true. And then since it's a VF, like none of this is really rendered yet. It's once it detects this is true, then it's going to dynamically render all of this stuff, right? So our input doesn't even exist yet. So I need to wait for the next tick. Next tick is just like the event loop. It's kind of more complex than I would like to get into, but basically we need to wait for it to render. And then once it's rendered, we can use something called a ref. So I'm going to add that ref here and call this like message edit input. And then we can reference that here. And we're going to use it as an HTML element. Wrap this in a parentheses. Cast it to HTML element. We're going to call it focus. So what this does is using this ref, it's kind of like an ID, but it's more accessible in Vue. Find the element, cast it into an HTML element, and then we want to focus it. Okay, so, I just forgot. Last thing we need to do is we need to pass the prop into this, right? So, let's pass the message in using this. Let's see, now we're passing this prop in, let's see how this looks. Okay, so now this shows up. Now we need to style those buttons, right? So actually, let me just go and make a style.css, because I might use these in the future too. So I'm just going to make some global CSS classes for these buttons, just so I can reuse them. And I'm going to make two types of buttons. I'm going to make a normal button, and then I'm going to make an outline button. So the outline will have an outline but no fill, and then the normal button is just a normal filled button. And we want hovers for effects for both of those. So yeah, let me just quickly do this. Okay, so pretty normal buttons, BTN and BTN outline. So let me make the cancel button an outline button, and then I'll make the save like a normal filled button. Crap. Okay, I forgot to import it into. Need to import it into here. So yeah, main. We need to import it into main because that's where. That's where everything comes together. So import style.css here. And we'll restart the server. And refresh this. Okay, there we go. Now we have these two buttons, keeping with the teal color, kind of. And yep, so last part I want to do for this is we need to add a listener for the message edit. And to do it, we're going to do that in chat.vue because chat.vue has access to all of the messages array. And so I'm going to make a function called edit message. And I'm going to take in a payload called message data. And then here, I'm going to add the listener, right? So on message edit, we're going to take in that payload of the ID and the text, right? And so we're going to say edit message with this message data. Then in edit message, I'm going to first find the message that we're trying to edit. So in the current messages, I'm going to use this find function again. We want the message ID to match the message data ID. And then I'm going to use this feature from Lodash. If you're not familiar, Lodash just is a bunch of has a bunch of very useful JavaScript functions, basically. And this one, assign, what it does is it assigns all the properties from the second object. It takes two properties, right? So I'll show you. Put message object first and message data second. So what it does is it takes, this is the original, right? Message object as the original. And then any extra data that we have here, it will take it and assign it to message object and overwrite any existing ones. So, but it will keep all the ones that were on message object originally otherwise. So message object has like a bunch of things like ID and the text, right? And those are going to get overridden if anything changed by message data, so the body text, right? But things like the timestamp and the sender are not going to get overwritten, and they're still going to be there. So, and it will still keep message object reference, so we don't even have to, take it out of the array and put it back in. It'll just directly add all that data in. So that's good. Okay, so honestly, yeah, now we can try this part out. Let's see. Go here, add some stuff, hit save, hit enter. Okay, that seems to work. Yeah, and so obviously this is not a message that we send, so like technically from a permission standpoint, this is all wrong, but like we'll worry about that later. And okay. Okay, so the last part we want to take care of is adding the part to the logic to delete the messages, as well as some basic like transition effect for deleting the message. Okay, so again, let's go back to the message actions, right? Because that's where it's going to be on this trash can icon. And we're going to add the click handler again and say delete message. And in this one, we'll probably do a similar event, emit, say message delete, and pass the ID again. And then over in chat.view, we want to listen for this. So we'll say this.bus.on, and we say message delete. Then we're going to take this message ID and we're gonna, let's write the delete message function here. Delete message with the message ID string, and we'll pass that here. Delete message with message ID. Okay. And then in delete message, so this function should be pretty straightforward. We're going to set this .current messages equal to the filter output of this filter function. So we want basically we want to keep all the messages that where the ID is not equal to the message ID, because this message ID is the one we want to delete. So keep all the ones that are not equal to that. And that will filter this array, filter that specific message out of this array. That this can work. So as you see, we click it and it just deletes it. Refresh it and it'll reset it. Okay. Now that transition effect I was talking about, so you see how when we delete it here, it just kind of disappears. It's kind of abrupt. So we'll add a transition effect to kind of indicate, oh, the message is being deleted in a more UI-friendly way. So, or user-friendly way, sorry. Let's go to the messages container, and I'm going to make use of this Vue feature called transition group. Transition group can be applied to a group of elements, such as, when you're iterating over something, and transition only applies to one single element. But what it does is it can apply, like, using the transition group, you can add like different CSS classes at different stages, like when it's entering versus leaving, and it has some defined conventions for you to do that. So let's add a name. This is the message list, And so when we add the name, what that does is we can define these classes, right, using the name. So message list leave active. What this means is like when an item is leaving inside this transition group, that means like going from existing to not existing. Now we can apply these transitional CSS properties, So it's going to have a transition on all different transitions and with a duration of 200 milliseconds. And we're going to add this class to leave to, which means this is what the end state of the leaving element should be, So it starts off like being visible, but then at the end of the transition, we want it to be at opacity 0, so it's going to be kind of clear. Okay, so now you see when we delete it, it kind of fades out over time, right? Over those 200 milliseconds. So you can kind of see it leaving, and it doesn't just disappear into thin air. So that's good. And the last part I want to add is a feature where when we type, like say I type a bunch of messages, right now, the scroll position of a div naturally will not change as you add more height to it, which is the case here with the elements down here. And so you see it remains at the same scroll position and it doesn't scroll down as we send new messages, right? So that's not what we want. We want it to scroll to the bottom every time. And so what we can do is we have this transition group. It has a hook called after enter. And so what it means is after a component has entered into this transition group, so like went from not existing to existing, and it can detect it based on the key, right? So every time we add a new message, it's like, oh, there's a new element being added to this transition group. Once that element is added, then it'll call this function based on this hook. And so what we're going to do is we're going to use refs. And let me define a ref on this one. This is the part that's scrolling. The div, you see, overflow y scroll. So we're going to call this the message scroll container using the ref. And so every time a new element is added, we're going to first retrieve this as an HTML element. Then what we're going to do is set the scroll top is equal to scroll height. Like scroll height is the max, like if you scrolled all the way to the bottom, like the maximum you can scroll to. Basically it's saying scroll all the way to the bottom every time. And let's see if this is working. So you see 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. See, now it's keeping up with what I'm typing when it sends a new message. That's basically what I wanted to showcase for this video. Like, now we can delete these messages and we can edit them and all that good stuff and send messages and then switch between these different channels. And so eventually we're gonna want it. The next episode I'm probably gonna start building the REST API on the backend, like doing some of the modeling for the backend models, just so we can solidify our data models, and then that way we can actually know like what data we're going to be getting from the backend before we go any further on the front end. And yeah, so that's kind of what we'll be doing next week. We can get into the Django side of things, and so be sure to stay tuned, and if you subscribe and turn notifications on, then you can know when my videos will come out. Typically I'm going to try to do it every Friday, but last week with Thanksgiving kind of fell off of that, so I was going to try to get back onto the schedule. So thanks guys for watching, and yeah, be sure to like if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.